Welcome back, everyone. This is Jose Nino bringing you another fantastic episode of El Nino Speaks. And I had a repeat guest back on in Thomas 77. How are things going with you, Thomas?
I'm very well. Thanks for inviting me to have this discussion.
Well, it's been almost a year since I last brought you back on, and that was right on the heels of the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. And to say that things have gotten even more explosive since then would be an understatement. Yeah, like the past week, man, you had the Israelis assassinating Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, and then they followed it up with some what seems like a limited incursion into Lebanon that has already racked up some casualties on the IDF side. And Iran responded with several strikes on Israel. What is your general impression of like the latest series of happenings?
I mean, there's two things going on in terms of why Israel widened the war. One of them is the fact that the way to understand Hezbollah is it's basically the foreign legion of Iran. You know, Iran does have, I mean, a pretty respectable military culture, but they're not really suited to the kind of direct action that's required to kind of strike at Israel in the ways that would be fruitful. You know, and really the fight between Israel and Iran it's in Syria, it's in I mean, broad geostrategic terms, it constitutes what's called the Shia crescent by some of these like Stratford types. So I don't put a lot of value in their analyses, but I mean that's become kind of common nomenclature. And I mean, northern Lebanon is key, not just because Israel can be hit from there, but Lebanon is a prize. It's a prize objective. If for no other reason, I wanted the fact that it's one of the only viable sources of natural potable water in the region, and so there's that. I mean, they've got to they got to sustain and exploit like operational capabilities in Lebanon. Otherwise they're not really in the game in terms of what half of this conflict entails. Which is really them being able to neutralize Hezbollah and its ability to assault Israel proper. Secondly, Netanyahu has got a lot of he's in a very tenuous position, and really the only thing keeping him alive politically and possibly keeping him in the free world. One of the only things not one of the only reasons he hasn't come under indictment, frankly, owing to some of these ongoing corruption charges that are actually have been substantiated. He's got a real problem. It's not just cap. He's got this kind of bizarre constellation of factions around him that represent the Likud coalition. And the Israelis, if they have a choice, even people who don't like Netanyahu, they're not just going to like swap out the civilian executive and generate some political crisis when they're in the midst of a major war. So there's like a perverse incentive for Netanyahu to kind of exploit hostilities within manageable parameters if he's able to do that for as long as possible. And I think it's pretty clear that's what he's doing. I think I know something about the Jewish people and their culture. I don't know a lot about the internal situation in Israel as regards their political culture, beyond brass tacks stuff and kind of how their military is organized and things. They've got an odd political culture, and I don't know why Netanyahu. I don't understand his staying power. It's not like he's not a military guy. Like it's not like he's some great battlefield leader who they rely on to devise operational strategies. It's not like he's some great man of the people. But for whatever reason, he's essential to Likud sustaining its position as the party currently stands. And that's basically what's going on, man. I mean, there's the war in Gaza is a race war that owes Israel's ongoing permanent emergency relating to the kind of state that it is. It's not a liberal democracy. It's asinine, but it's also not really. It's not just like this authoritarian state or whatever kind of the conventional critique of it is. It's a racial state. It's a totally abnormal country, and they've got a real problem, and Hamas really caught them lacking. And that's unarguable. That's just objectively true. So I mean this is basically two conflicts that have a common nucleus of causation. The Syrian Lebanese front, which can be thought of as kind of like aspects of the same conflict, and like the Gaza front. I mean, both of Israel's main ops, they've managed to bridge the sectarian divide in very substantive ways, and that's pretty fascinating. That owes more to like U.S. and Israeli ineptitude than anything else in battlefield terms. But it's also, I think, the thing that was precluding that was these Salafi maniacs like Zarqawi, who I look at ISIS as basically like the progeny of Zarqawi. Like Al Qaeda in Iraq became this offshoot thing that was like this lunatic takfiri tendency that was singularly fixated on like dropping Shia bodies. That's kind of what became ISIS. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that thankfully those people have been crushed for all practical purposes.
Just to interrupt, what does
Yeah.
takfiri mean?
I mean, basically, it means a lot of things. It's complicated. It doesn't have a direct translation, but basically, if you're a Salafi, you views Shia as like not real Muslims, and you have like a murderous disposition towards them. Like that's not its textbook definition, but it's kind of shorthand for what we're talking about. Like Zarqawi, bin Laden didn't have any love for the Shia. It's not like he was some like ecumenical guy, but he was constantly coming back to like, our only enemy is the United States and the Jews. That's it. Like that's who we're fighting in operational terms. That's who we target. Whatever our problems with the Shia or anybody else, that'll be resolved later. So Bin Laden was not telling his people like go out and like take heads, go out and kill the Shia, go out and like purify Islam in Iraq or in Lebanon or anything like that. When he got kind of sidelined, Bin Laden wasn't some shot caller, despite what people claim. I mean, that's nonsense. But he and Zawahiri did, and the old Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which despite its kind of high incident name was not really a direct action element. But their whole thing was, what I said, it was like America and Israel are the enemy. America, Israel / the Jews. That's the enemy. Zarqawi, he was in prison when he was basically apostate. He got locked in prison. He was like a street dude in Jordan. And when he was in prison, he became pious and then quite radicalized. And then when he hit the street again, his whole thing was basically like dropping Shia bodies. Like he fought the Americans too, like he fought the Israelis too, but his big thing was, we basically kill the Shia, we're purifying Iraq. And on the ground in Iraq, obviously, like Sunnis are the minority. I mean, in Darul Islam, they're a super majority, but in Iraq's part of the Shia heartland for practical purposes. So, I mean, that was kind of like ground zero for something like that, because the Sunnis have long been, they've long been had kind of a barracks sensibility. But in any event, so Osama, after the Battle of Tora Bora, I believe, and I mean, it seems not just because of where he was ultimately murdered. I mean, he was a fair target. I'm not saying that, but I mean, I believe after the Battle of Tora Bora and what some of the men who were there with him claimed, they said like when we basically ran to Tora Bora because we were under assault by the Americans and Allied elements, and we thought we were going down, but then the Americans just broke contact. Why that happened is an open-ended question. Like some of these special operations type guys have their own takes. People who hate Rumsfeld and company, like they claim that like this was botched, like quite literally at executive cabinet level. But whatever happened, like the American special forces types and the guys who were allied with them at the time, what was like loosely called the Northern Alliance, they broke contact, and Bin Laden and some of his people, they quite literally walked to Pakistan. And I don't believe he left after that. But he was by that time, I mean, he was in poor health anyway. And Bin Laden, he actually had very good battlefield command chops, at least at, like platoon or company level. I mean, that's kind of what like created his legend, among Salafis was the Battle at Jaji in 1987. He uh, he and his people stood and fought off the vastly superior OPFOR Soviet force that was pounding them with combined arms, and it was during Ramadan on a very significant day. And but be it as it may, Bin Laden was basically sidelined after that, and it's not like he was some shot caller anyway. It's like the strength of Al Qaeda or like Salafism in battlefield terms. Like Zarqawi was he was their top like operator slash commander, and his priority was sectarian stuff. We're gonna drop Shia bodies. We're gonna stack them 10 feet high. We're gonna cut off people's heads. And I'm not gonna sit here and say Bin Laden was a good guy because he wasn't. But I think he would have been horrified by that, man. Not just in pragmatic terms, because that's a terrible image to project to the world. But I don't think that's the way he thought about stuff. That's what the like core of Salafism became in terms of the people who are willing to pick up their rifle and wage holy war. It became these lunatics who were in it, for sectarian reasons, because they wanted to drop bodies, because I mean, who knows? I mean, I'm not going to reduce the motivations of guys who join movements like that to simple-minded things, but like point being, I mean, Bin Laden was very much sidelined, and that's one of the things that got to hurt, the like Al Qaeda generally, or in that kind of minority perspective. That's what it was. I mean, I think Al Qaeda basically accomplished its major objective. Its major objective in hitting Washington, D.C. and the Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Their basic objective was to draw America into like a general war with Darul Islam, and that happened. And they accomplished a lot of what they wanted to accomplish. Like, I mean, basically, like every Arab regime where there's a Sunni majority on the ground, like they've got to at least like abide some like Salafi demands. Like the days of like secular Arabism, like that's dead. America's got no credibility in the world anymore, and it's basically a pariah state, just like Israel. So I mean that's a huge win. Is there some sort of like Salafi caliphate like waiting in the wings? Like no, and that's never going to happen. But I think I mean it'll take another 50 years to really see like what the full kind of implications of all these events that we just raised, like what they're kind of the full kind of historical impact of these things. We can't tell yet, but I think Bin Laden basically accomplished. He's probably about like 50% successful. Okay, but that kind of armed Salafi movement that has global reach, and I mean they were serious guys. They deployed to Bosnia in 91 to 95. That was that's really kind of like where they cut their teeth as a real international movement.
Around that time as well, Hezbollah was also in Bosnia. That's like one of the few times where you saw those Sunni and Shiite networks kind of become strange bedfellows to some extent. Just to shift the discussion a bit to like more like the leaders. So you talked about Bin Laden. Now on the Shia side, what is your general assessment about the legacy of Hassan Nasrallah? Because his assassination was definitely a big, like, symbolic and spiritual blow to Hezbollah.
I mean, it wasn't. There's a real cult of martyrdom in Shia Islam. Like, that's true. It's not just something like stupid Zionists or like ignorant, like Fox News type people say. Like that doesn't mean like you're crazy or they want to blow themselves up, but if you're in the game and the way these guys are who come into lives the Hezbollah, like you're not sitting around like shivering with fear that you're gonna get dropped by the Mossad or by the Americans. Like that's gonna happen at some point, and you're fine with it. That's part of the whole. That's part of the stuff they revere. That's part of like you join Hezbollah, and also in Nasrallah, he wasn't a military leader. Like like his predecessor was murdered too by like Mossad
Yes.
allied elements, and it's like. So it's like, Nasrallah knew that like his time on Earth was limited. The fact that he was around for 30 years in the role, that's kind of incredible. And I mean, it's like it'd be like if in 1990 the SAS had like up and shot Jerry Adams in the face, and then there was like this kind of like massive chimp out of we killed the IRA. It's like, no, you didn't, man. You killed you killed some political hack.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like I mean, I don't really know what to say. I mean, it's like there's not the military benefit of whacking Nasrallah like means nothing. And there's these like idiots on the internet and in legacy media, and they're kind of faggot fanboys who are like, yeah, Hezbollah's whole leadership cast got killed. And it's like, this isn't a video game, man. Like you didn't like beat the final boss of Hezbollah. And it's the Israelis, all they have vis-a-vis Hezbollah and Iran, and the IDF basically got its face broken the last time they fought Hezbollah in theater, which was 2006. All they do is they'll sweep in. I mean, I think IDF is pretty squared away. I'm not saying they're like a bad force or they're like not competent. I think they're actually pretty tight. But the Israelis do this stuff. They'll like blow up a bunch of kids in Gaza, or they'll kill some like random general in Iran who is not even commanding forces in theater, or they'll murder some 60-year-old cleric who's like probably never even picked up a gun in his life. And then there'll be this like weeks long like fireworks celebration of like, yeah, we killed Hezbollah. Like it's really transparent, man. And they didn't used to do that. Like, not because like they were classy people or like good guys or something, but it's just like a bad look. Like it's not, you don't base military operations on what's going to get you like likes on social media, or you don't do it for clout. You don't do it so you can like high five people in like a 2-minute like Fox News segment. It's like I wasn't bad for morale that Nasrallah died. I mean, people were like sad about it, but I mean, it's like I don't. Again, like in that subculture, like Americans don't really understand it. Like it's probably people, everybody except the Orthodox in Eastern Europe, I mean, would find this kind of thing like pretty morbid. And I'm not saying that like Orthodox people are morbid or something at all, but they've got a more kind of, they've got a more kind of casual view of life and death than other Christians. Like these Shia guys who click up with Hezbollah, they're not normal people. And like I'm not even saying that punitively, but they're not guys who are like worried about promotions at work and like fantasy football and kind of stuff like normal suburban guys with families are worried about. They've got a very strange view of the world by modern metrics, and they're totally fine with the fact they're gonna die. And anyone who takes that role, nobody puts a gun to your head and is like, you got to like go like be the public face of Hezbollah. If you do that, that you're going to be killed at some point. Like either by some crazy Salafi suicide bomber, or by some Mossad killer, or by some American drone strike. Like what's going to happen. And you're okay with that. That's the whole point. So, I mean, that's my read on it.
Yeah, these decapitation strikes that you hear people talk about, I like the point you raised about the video game mentality, because I think the general impression I've had about these Strat 4 and military analysis types is that they are very Call of Duty Ghost Recon brained, in the sense that they're like, the way they view a lot of these military affairs is like a video game mission where you go after like some target. The objective is to kill like this one leader. And then once you complete that, you like are able to collapse a large portion of that military. And based on your, but that's really not how like things generally work out. And based on your reading of a lot of these military encounters, do decapitation strikes against like military leadership work swimmingly, or is it much more complicated?
And there's one operational paradigm where decapitation strikes work and are a real thing, and that's nuclear war. And that's a very, very real thing. And it's incredibly destabilizing when you're talking about a theretofore basically balanced paradigm. Like it can be a very destabilizing element when that kind of capability is accomplished and deployed. But with nuclear weapons, you're talking about massive destructive power. And you're talking about, with modern command and control, like an incredibly narrow window of situational awareness and opportunity to respond or deter an attack. So basically, like in the final phase of the Cold War, kind of like the real coup America was able to pull off militarily was deploying ground launched cruise missiles. They're colloquially called Glickum, and intermediate range ballistic missiles on the inner German border. Because with both of those platforms, with then current technologies of 1983, you could hit Moscow within 5 minutes with a nuclear strike. Okay. And Soviet command and control, it was concentrated in two places. It was concentrated in Moscow, it was concentrated in Kazakhstan. The latter, of course, was and is, Star City, where the Russians launched their launch vehicles into orbital space. And owing to the elevation, like the natural elevation there, owing to weather patterns, other things, that's also like a very good place from where to like launch like nuclear weapons. Okay. So if you can, and that was also the issue with orbital bombardment platforms, like had they been kind of viably devised and then deployed, because if you launch a nuclear strike from orbit, your target knows he's under assault, like basically like when he's imminently going to be hit. There is no early warning. Okay, so if you're in a position to do that to your enemy with nuclear weapons, he can't respond. He does not. He's got all of like 3 to 5 minutes to identify that an attack is underway, characterize the nature of that attack, and then devise like a response to that attack or some kind of countermeasure. And you can't do that in 3 minutes. Okay, so that's when we talk about decapitation in military terms. That's really what we're talking about in terms of operational viability and what's really going to cripple your enemy. And because after that, you can basically strike him at will. Okay. Because even if there's like a dead hand switch on his nuclear forces, whereby, say, I think the Soviets had something rigged by by the year in question. And there were super hardened silos, where they had these like SS-20s and stuff. And like they detect if they detected like an if they detected an explosion at at megaton scale or like kiloton scale within like a 5 mile radius, that would initiate a mechanism whereby like 12 hours later, unless disturbed, it would launch this primitive drone vehicle that would then like transmit a signal down to ground control, where presumably like all human operators are dead and decision makers are dead. And that signal would then like trigger like the launch of like remaining munitions like in that silo. But you can even like knock those out with if you like directly target them, and there's gonna be some kind of retaliation anyway. There's gonna be like, even if it's not like a proper second strike, you gotta be able to absorb that. I mean, it's complicated. But point being, the only time decapitation is really viable is you're talking about discrete paradigms where nuclear weapons are kind of the currency, for lack of a better word, or like a primary platform that's being employed in war fighting. Like it doesn't really track if you're talking about fighting non-state actors, or even if you're talking about like a conventional military force. I mean, it's like when Ho Chi Minh died, did like North Vietnam just like go to hell and like not? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. That's not the way. That's not the way military forces are organized, and that's sociologically that's not the way warfare works. I mean, I can imagine some kind of uprising, like like John Brown or something. Like, John Brown was that crazy preacher abolitionist, who raised this kind of slave revolutionary army with pikes and, but I mean, like, that was literally like, it was almost like a Jim Jones figure. Like, when when he and his people were defeated, Brown was captured, and like very quickly hanged. Like, that just kind of ceased to exist, because that literally was like, it was like movement around a guy, but that's a totally scaled down iteration of what we're talking about, and that's like a rare instance of a phenomenon that doesn't really apply, So no, there's not. But it's also like, operationally, like, what's your operational doctrines get corrupted by performance metrics that are basically political. It's like, what's your performance metric in, like, quote, fighting Hezbollah? It's like, well, unless you're actually assaulting Lebanon, you're penetrating, like, the Shia ghettos, which are their heartland in Beirut. You're going house to house and, like, blowing them away, until their ability to deploy has basically been eradicated. Unless you're doing that, you're really not, quote, fighting Hezbollah. So, like, what's your performance metric? Oh, well, this guy is a high value target. So let's say about the police, like, decide, like, okay, if we're able to, like, make so many arrests, or, like, seize so much fentanyl or heroin, or seize so many, like, unregistered firearms, that means, like, this is what we view as performance. So that's part of it too. Like, I don't, like, I'm sure there's, like, guys on the IDF side who wouldn't be super thrilled at the prospect of assaulting Beirut, but they're probably sitting there like, what are we doing? Like, why are we trying to, like, blow up just, like, these guys, like, or like these, quote, key figures? But that's, I mean, it's one part politics, one part civilian authorities, and kind of politically ambitious officers who don't have a lot of battlefield experience. It's just not even what they devise that's like, okay, this means we win. That's a problem in any military establishment, that, with rare exceptions. I don't think the Germans really did that. To their credit, like the Soviets and today the Russian Federation, they don't really do that. But they were and are kind of in unique circumstances. But that's sort of a tangent.
Based on what you're saying, then, because what you previously said about Israel's current operations kind of being for clout and generating a bunch of, like, effusive praise from pseudo experts on social media, would you say that pager attack that Mossad or whatever, like, Israeli element coordinated against Hezbollah operatives pretty much served the same purpose, or do you think that was actually, like, more impactful than, like, the assassination of Nasrallah?
I think it was more impactful in some ways. Like the Mossad is a weird organization too. Like, they're not just like the quote Israeli CIA, and they're not even really like the Russian FSB, or they're like their own thing. They're like one part sort of like direct action, kind of SOCOM type force. They're like one part intelligence agency. They're like one part kind of like internal security apparatus. But they're pretty good at terrorizing people.
Yes.
And they
Yeah.
did. This guy Abu Ibrahim, he kind of, after the Abu Nidal organization was kind of a creature of the Cold War. That was kind of the primary, like they were technically secular. They were like this, like, liberationist tendency. Those guys, they targeted. But subsequent, this guy Abu Ibrahim, he was kind of the organization around him was kind of the most effective that the Palestinians had in terms of their own kind of like terrorist elements or direct action elements or adjacent people. And they blew him up with this, like, weird, like, phone bomb, like, back in the 90s. And after that, it was a while before anybody emerged really to kind of fill their role, because I think that was a pretty savvy operational innovation. And I think the pager thing's the same way, because you can't even use burner phones anymore, because they're just like there's no OPSEC. So it's actually pretty smart that these guys in the ground are like, okay, let's start, like, fucking with these, like, 1990s pagers. And it's like, okay, so some Mossad guy or guys was like, well, we can't, you can't you can't surveil these things in any meaningful capacity, but you can flood the market with a bunch of ones that are actually little bombs. So if you don't know if like the device that you're relying on, basically for command and control, down to like the squad level, if you don't know that those devices you're relying upon are going to like explode when activated, I mean that shakes people up. And even if it doesn't, like it kind of foobars your ability to get around some of these command and control and community telecom exigencies. So I think that was pretty innovative and probably pretty effective, but it's not really Israel's problem at the moment. I mean, like it's not like this isn't the 1970s. It's not like Israel's getting hit by the PLO or by the PFLP General Command or by the Unidal organization. It's not like guys are like planting bombs on buses or something and like every week, and that's the problem. It's not like Hezbollah's command and control doesn't rely on the ability to communicate with pagers. Like Hamas, yeah, Hamas is like the core of ops for in Gaza, but they're fighting a race war against the Palestinian people. So really, their ops are like any military age male, or even like any lady who's like healthy enough to squeeze a trigger competently and be on target at close range. It's like okay, I mean, you've got a demographic problem, and you've got you're at war with this population that you basically hemmed into like this giant camp. I mean, like it's not a question of like removing this discrete element with like some kind of scalpel like precision, verbally speaking, by sabotaging their command and control capability. But I do think it was impactful. The Israelis are good at that kind of stuff. They're kind of devious people. But I mean, beyond that, like I said, like the IDF and Assad isn't a joke. I think Netanyahu is a joke, but I know their military staff isn't, and they've got a lot of competent commanders, but they've got some real problems, man. Like I said, like Israel got caught lacking when Hezbollah assaulted, or when Hamas assaulted. Forgive me for the error. Last October, they assumed when they broke through the barrier fence that that the first wave would be wiped out. But they were able to get like a company-sized element through there, and when they did, there was nobody there. So they assaulted into Israel proper. When the IDF finally figured out what was going on, they brought combined arms up to bear and started like hosing them with fire. But by then, like the damage was done. And like that's a huge fuck up. That shouldn't have happened, especially considering what's been going on the past several years. It's not like this was out of the blue or something. But yeah.
My impression of Israel is that because of like the geographical constraints of it, its population constraints, that it's a country that doesn't have like much strategic depth. So it's going to invest a lot in terms of intelligence services, especially on the offensive end. Yeah, and one thing you mentioned about Mossad that is interesting is it's not a typical intelligence organization. It also has this kind of like refugee extraction capacity where it tries to rescue Jews from like diaspora, like in hostile areas abroad. That's what it had that function a lot during like the 70s up until the 90s. There's like a good book, I think it's called like Every Spy a Prince, that talks about that. But when it comes to like conventional military, Israel can definitely fight against like a lot of the Arab armies as seen in the 60s and 70s against those conventional forces then. But it seems that now any type of like sophisticated operation, like say against like Hezbollah or even like Iran, which is far away, is much farther away and is bigger and has a more intricate network of proxies, it's gonna have a tougher time. And yeah, Hezbollah especially, even though it's taken some blows with the pager stuff and all of that, it seems that in general, Lebanon has given Israel a lot of fits over the last, I'd say like over 40 years. Every time it's made, Israel has made incursions into Lebanon, whether pre-Hezbollah, because Hezbollah didn't emerge till like 83 or so, like the mid 80s. And up until the present, and it seems like that country has its number. What do you think explains that?
And part of it's the terrain. I mean, last thing you want to do is fight in Lebanese ghettos and trying to rout, Hezbollah out of their urban heartland. I mean, that's just a terrible slog. It's just like an infantry slog, and there's no way to not like take casualties doing it. Then it's nasty, and it's a mess. But it's also, so there's that. Okay, Hezbollah is also just very game. I'd argue that they're absolutely the best after IDF. They're absolutely like the best infantry element in the region. They're very
Yes.
tough, very motivated guys. They've got a lot of experience. They're just a hard force that's squared away, and at what they do, they're very, very good at it. So I mean, I think it's that simple. The thing to also keep in mind, man, and like Pete Q and I have been discussing this in a series we're doing. What changed everything with respect to Israel's military situation was the 73 war. The October 73 war. Like the Jews call it the Yom Kippur War. The Shia and the Sunni call it the Ramadan War. Like generally in American history books, it's the 1973 war. And America had reached DEFCON 3 in the midst of it. The Soviet Union actually deployed nuclear forces to the port of Alexandria. They didn't marry them to their launch vehicles, but on the Nixon tapes, when Nixon says to Kissinger, like, we can't blow up the world for these fucking people, he was talking about the Israelis, okay? And on the Egyptian front, the Egyptian army got routed and surrounded, and Brezhnev gave the order. He said that if Israel moves on Cairo, or if they had not moved to annihilate the Egyptian army, like, we're going to assault. Okay, so the Soviet Union went on high alert, which in turn America went on high alert. And then before anybody knew it, like, American missileers were like strapping into their seats in their hardened silos, and we were at DEFCON 3. It was a mess. But on the Syrian front, first of all, the Soviets actually deployed, and since 1967, like, the Soviet army had been like fighting the IDF. The Russians and the Israelis are always at war. Okay, they're mortal enemies. Anyone who doesn't know that is their head up their ass and isn't in the game. But also the Syrian Arab army, they hit Israel really hard in the opening salvos, and that kind of shattered the myth of Israeli military supremacy. And that's one of the things that made Israel willing to come to the table. If they realized, like, the next war, like, we may very well not win. Okay, so there's that. That's kind of been redacted in the American public mind. It's like it didn't happen or something. Everybody's like, oh, the Arab armies suck. They can't fight. It's like, that's actually not true, man. And plus, too, like, it depends on who we're talking about. Not every Arab army is like, like the kind of rump Iraqi army of 2003 or whatever. And I also say, man, like, in 91, and like Douglas McGregor, sometimes he gets the mark, sometimes he doesn't. But he was at 73 Easting, and he's like, combat resolves rapidly. And he's like, especially tank combat, unless you're talking about something like Kursk, which like never ever happens, it's basically totally one-sided. And he's like the Schwerpunkt of like the Iraqi army was stuff like the Hammurabi division, who he fought, who 11th ACR, Black Horse, like, fought at 70 Easting. He's like, these guys basically fought as well as can be expected given the conditions. He's like, the fact they got their asses kicked doesn't mean like they're a bunch of idiots. It means like we had their number. It means like they were executing Warsaw Pact tactics that we trained to fight our whole professional lives in the Fulda Gap. He's like, that the T-72s they were driving were subpar compared to what, like the Red Army had. He's like, it was all of those things. He's like, these guys didn't all just like up and surrender, and they weren't just like tripping over their dicks. So it's like a mixed bag. Like, yeah, I don't think like conventional Arab armies are some stellar thing, and I think the Egyptians they positively suck. The Syrian Arab army was basically like in revolt, save for like loyal elements who then came under like Russian command and control when the Russians intervened. That's its own thing. It wasn't just like incompetence or whatever, but it's complicated. And, like I said, on the Syrian front, or what we could consider the Syrian front in the 73 war, like, stuff did not go well for the Israelis, man. And yeah, part of that was because of like what was called like, the continuity war with the Soviet Union from 67 onward to 73. But part of it was just what I said. So, I mean, I think it's more complicated than most people allow.
That's actually a really good point you mentioned about how the Soviets and their Russian Federation successors have technically been at war with Russia in like a shadow war for some time. Because this reminds me of a recent post I dropped on Substack that's called the Blowback Chronicles Part 3, which details Russia's intervention in Georgia in '08. People tend to forget this, that in the lead up to the Russo-Georgian War, the Georgian leader, Mikhail Saakashvili, is a total like NATO NGO puppet. He was trying to make Georgia into like the Israel of the Caucasus.
Yep.
And he actually was receiving a good deal of military aid and equipment from the Israelis. In many ways, Georgia was kind of copying the model that the Azeris have done, where they've also have pacted a lot with the Israelis as well. And
Yep.
I actually think that the Azeris is even deeper. That cooperation is a lot deeper because the Azeris are like right next to Iran, and they have a pretty significant diaspora in Iran that could be potentially used as a fifth column. But
Well, yeah, I'm Ahmadinejad's an Azeri.
yeah, and that's actually a really good point, because then you have like Syria. That's even more blatant, where now like the Russians have like two military facilities, that airbase in Khmeimim and the naval base in Tartus. And I think just yesterday night, if I am not mistaken, a Russian munitions depot in Syria was struck by the Israelis. So yes, there's very much like a type of hybrid war between the Israelis and the Russians that's been going on for quite some time.
Well, they're also just like mortal enemies. Like anybody who doesn't understand that is like they're kind of staggeringly ignorant. Like the Russians and the Jews are mortal enemies. Like they hate each other. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't
Oh,
like,
yeah.
and that's, yeah. And like what the Ukraine war is part of the same conflict as the Syria war. And, the Russian Federation, Hezbollah, and like, the remnants of the Syrian Arab army, that remained loyal to Assad and that presumably were actually game fighters. They broke the face of Israel, NATO, and their terrorist proxies in Syria and totally foobarred their program. Ukraine going all in to like ethnically cleanse the Donbass, and basically like assaulting Russia on its own frontier. That is returning the serve for the defeat they took in Syria. Like it's 100%, it's 110% the same conflict. Like that's why these people, these like internet guys, like think they love Ukraine, or that Ukraine is like awesome, or that it's like this right wing country. Like they're like literally mentally retarded. It's staggering like how stupid these people are. But I mean, whatever. But yeah, that's part of this
Story of our time.
Yeah, but especially you're like a rare kind of. I mean, I don't even know what to say. It's like if you agree with Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, basically the Israeli street, the ADL and IPAC and Netanyahu, but you're going around like saying you're like a hard as fuck like Nazi, like you're literally retarded. You're like too stupid to live. But yeah, the like I said, it's part of this. It's not just part of. It's literally this. Like these are aspects of like the same conflict, and it's a perennial conflict. And it's like all like all the wars that Israel and the Jewish diaspora that sustains that are involved in. It's a race war, between them and the Russians and allied elements, like the Syrians and like the Iranians and like the Levantine Arabs and what have you.
So just to tie like a bow into all this as we approach the hour mark, do you see this conflict between Iran and Israel expanding? Because it looks like Israel is game to like expand as many fronts as possible, whether it's attacking Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and even probably Iran. And from the looks of it, it almost seems like they're trying to relive like an Old Testament fantasy of trying to reconsolidate lands of like greater Israel. Do you think there's something like that in play, or is this just like a chimp out by like the Israelis that just reflects that they're really not as strong as they seem, that they're just like flailing around violently?
I mean, Israel, in grand strategic terms, Israel wants to thin out the Palestinian population as much as they can.
Yes.
Because again, it's like a race war. The internal logic of Ross and Krieg is that's what you do. So trying to do that, they want to crush the forces in being and like the force capable structures, including demographic structures, in the Shia crescent as much as they can, to dominate the region at will. They also covet Lebanon. Again, it's a rare case of the territory kind of being the juice that's worth the squeeze. Israel needs Lebanon, not just, in for reasons of strategic depth, or at least as far as such things are possible, considering geographic limitations, but also again, it's a coveted source of potable water. What they're doing right now, like I said, I think within the bound irrationality of the inherent limitations of that Israel faces, based on what they can accomplish operationally, as well as what's realistic. Yeah, they absolutely are trying to widen the war, as kind of a detonation strategy, and because amidst like relative instability, I believe that they believe they'll have some like operational freedom that is heretofore been elusive. But I don't widening the war to Iran proper. I don't see that happening.
Yeah,
Like, I don't see
I
that.
see that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, despite a lot of people say that on both sides of the aisle, I don't see how that would develop in military terms. I don't really know what it would accomplish.
It almost seems like Israel is like trying to get like the US to like bail it out militarily. Do you see Netanyahu as like analogous to like a Winston Churchill type figure, like in the grand scheme of things? When you look at it, like
His psychological situation is very different. I mean, Churchill at base was like a pathetic individual, and Churchill didn't actually believe anything. Like, Churchill was a degenerate, and whoever was paying for him to live, because he certainly wasn't going to work for a living, and whoever was going to, sustain his kind of, his kind of genteel existence he was going to execute whatever orders they put on him, and he didn't care. He was that primitive in his sort of ambitions. Netanyahu, I think Netanyahu is a shit executive in a lot of ways. But like I said, for whatever reason, like he's the man that's like essentially keeping this kind of bizarre constellation of elements that constitutes the ruling coalition afloat. Okay. I think Netanyahu believes 110%. I think he's personally very corrupt. I think he's a crook and basically a criminal personality. But I also think he is, in fact, he believes everything he says. Like, he believes in the Zionist cause and in very conventional terms. He's not putting on airs. He's not just saying things that he thinks will resonate. So that's what the difference is. Does Israel want America to intervene? Yeah, and of course that's always kind of on their mind. And like Bin Laden said, one thing he was actually right about, like Israel and America are like they're like heads of the same hydra. There's no difference. You got to look at them.
oh yeah, they're consolidated. Yeah, they
But I don't
yeah.
think the America, just to wrap it up, America doesn't have the force structure or the forces in being or the political will to intervene at scale. We just don't. I guarantee you that like special operations command types are running around. I mean, from like American forces are absolutely running around in theater with indexed with Israeli forces, at operational level. But there's not going to be a conventional intervention if for no other reason that there's just not the forces there, nor the political will.
I actually wanted to touch upon this, like to shift our gaze up northward. It looks like the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it's not so much like stalemated, but it's moving like slowly. And you had like that whole Kursk incursion by the Ukrainians, which looks like a total fool's errand from the looks of it. Where do you see the conflict in Ukraine going? Do you believe that Russia will be able to like impose some type of Cold War style split between East and West Ukraine, or will this conflict just end up getting frozen sometime next year?
A little bit of both. I mean, there's no military path to victory for Ukraine, and like there never was. So this entire conflict has been totally pointless, unless you look at it as what I said, a way to basically impose attrition on Russia in an ongoing capacity, and basically tie them down on their own frontier and punish them for inflicting the loss they did on Israel and America and Syria. That's the only way it makes sense. So Russia's just waiting for NATO to quit. The Kursk bullshit, the Kharkov front. I mean, if we can talk about a main line of resistance, not just in Ukraine, but in any like modern war these days, that would be it. The Ukrainians, are close to collapse because they're just eating unsustainable attrition. I think the Kharkov thing, it was both like a way for them to claim in world media that, because all the Ukrainians' entire con is they they police up as many reserves and like conscripts as they can. They outfit them with a bunch of drones and a bunch of NATO hardware. Then they like pointlessly assault the Russians, and then they have like a week long like victory party saying that like they won. Like, and they do this over and over again. So the Kursk incursion was that, so they can claim on social media that they're winning or whatever. But it's also, I think, such that it had any kind of tactical intelligence. It was to relieve the Kharkov front. And again, like I said, I'm not suggesting this is like a main line of resistance like we'd think of it between, like Germany contra France in 1940 or something, but basically to relieve pressure on like primary fronts in theater, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But I mean, nothing Ukraine does makes a lot of sense, because like the entire point of the war is that it doesn't make any sense, and it's just to like hurt the Ivans. So I mean, what the Russians are doing is they're like, okay, you're just like continually attacking us. You have no military path to victory. You say you're just like going to like fight this war in perpetuity. You refuse to engage in meaningful diplomatic activity. So I guess we're just going to keep killing you until you stop. I mean, because that's the only position Moscow can take. So whenever like NATO stops, whenever the Ukrainians stop like committing suicide and then declaring they won, like the war will end. Yeah, basically like when the war ends, because like a Trump administration like stops it and just says, or if Congress or if there's like a Republican Congress that realizes, like, not a principle, but realizes there's no support for this war on the ground, like even if like these Pentagon faggots like are trying to keep continue to fight it, those cut off the money and eventually it'll stop. But yeah, like the front will stabilize basically, the Donbass and Eastern Ukraine being like part of the Russian Federation, and there being this like rump state of Western Ukraine, essentially like a NATO basing hub. But that the problem with that is that because NATO is populated by people who literally they're like crack smokers. They're like literally insane.
Yes.
They're literally insane and like really, really, really stupid. Like they have no, it's like trying to reason like little kids or like crackheads. So like if they try and move like hypersonic missiles there or something like that, that's an act of war. And in precedented terms, you're basically like, you're a fair target for a nuclear strike if you do that, like whatever country puts them there. But hopefully, I mean, I don't even think like the UK is that fucking stupid, but we'll see. But yeah, that's basically how this is going to shake out.
Yeah, there's actually a really interesting point you raised about NATO, how it's just like made up of a bunch of freaks. Like you have like transgender types and like political activists. Like that guy, the Ryan Ralph or whatever, the second would be assassin for of Trump. There's also a guy that I think would actually like fit right in to NATO. When would you say did like that NATO started to experience this massive like decline in terms of like the personnel it's able to bring on board and staff?
Well, I mean, two things happened. I in NATO, the purpose for NATO to exist evaporated on the night of November 9th, 1989. So
Yeah, fair point.
NATO continues to exist. NATO continues to exist for the sake of existing. Like after that, like like the point of any IGO and specifically and particularly military alliance is it's like just exists. Like it has to have a purpose. So if it doesn't, it's literally just like this kind of like it's literally just kind of like this like zombie organization that exists for the sake of existing and is constantly trying to find a way to rationalize itself existing. Like Turkey is America's NATO ally, and like America's periodically
Yes.
at war. Does that mean America's obligated to attack itself because it's periodically at war with Turkey? Like that, according to the NATO charter, it is. But I mean, you had that. So like nobody who had any sense like would involve themselves in NATO like after 1989, and especially not after it became clear that under Clinton that the military was just like at command level was this totally politicized like insane institution that like the Clinton administration had basically purged of any rational people and it was now basically like a social engineering element that wanted to like pull like some kind of that basically like viewed itself as like one of the NGOs that was trying to like forcibly integrate Chicago but with nuclear weapons. Like so nobody has anything going on in their life or isn't a crackhead like wants anything to do with an organization like that. But and even the people who aren't like totally insane, they're just like really stupid. Like why? If your job is literally to go to like command post briefings, you pretend that like Putin is this evil guy who's going to like attack people for no reason, and that you're like a Marvel Comics character, like protecting everybody. Like you're a fucking idiot. Like anybody who does that is an idiot. So it's like you spend your days doing idiotic things. You've got something of a deformed psychology, and you probably have character issues too. It's all of those things.
Yeah, that's been my impression as well. And I think it's just like another.
Yeah, just let me see real quick too. Even if it made strategic sense to devise, like some sort of military alliance like against the Russian Federation, like even if that made strategic sense, like you wouldn't organize it like NATO. That's not the way that military alliances are configured in the 21st century. It's just not. So I mean, it's like it's irrational in terms of its raison d'etre, which no longer exists. Like, but it's configured in a way that doesn't make any sense. It's just not how things are done these days.
It's just like a sign of like the wholesale decline of American institutions. It's just now extending to like the foreign policy realm.
Yeah, that's well stated.
Well, I think this is a great place to bookmark this conversation, Thomas. But as always, man, I thoroughly enjoy my discussions with you. And before we leave, let my audience know what projects you have going on right now and what where they can stay up to date on your latest work.
Yeah, thank you, man. I'm pretty active on Substack these days. I like the Substack platform. I mean, I may be a retard, but I find stuff like Gumroad and a lot of these other things like impossible to use. Like I literally, like I cannot make sense of them. So I like Substack a lot. I post some long form stuff there. I drop a podcast bi-weekly there called Mind Phaser. It's real Thomas777.substack.com. I'm on Twitter. Like my shit got hacked some weeks back, but that got remedied. And like it's the same timeline I've had since January 2023. It's at capital REAL underscore number 7 HOMAS 777. I've got a website. It's just Thomas777.com, number 7 HOMAS 777.com. I'm on like Instagram and like Tgram and all that kind of stuff. I'm trying to get the jump on. I got these like ongoing like for print publication manuscripts I'm working on, And I was hoping that that'd be ready by the winter time, but I'm gonna be traveling a bunch for like business related purposes. I mean, relating to like partisan stuff. I'm not just going on vacation. I'm gonna travel to see the West Coast fellas. Then I'm going down south to see some of the fellas in the Confederate States and network with them. So I'm gonna be traveling a bunch this winter. So I'm probably like realistically like this what like the main manuscript I'm working on is probably not going to drop till spring. People have been asking about Steel Storm, like my science fiction series. I'm writing the third one right now. I'm going to consolidate all of them into one volume when I finish the third one and release it as like a hardback. I'm going to try and keep the price as low as possible. But I think people would like that. And, I like the serial. I went with the serialized format for a reason to begin with, but what is that? And people responded very well. But that's probably not going to happen until summer. But yeah, that's what I got on the pipeline right now.
Fantastic stuff, man. I strongly recommend my listeners to tune in and subscribe to all of Thomas's content because it is very sharp and evergreen and relevant to boot. And as always, thank you to my audience for your generous attention. And with that, El Nino has spoken.